Welcome to Amphibian and Reptile Conservation's podcast series. My name's Howard Innes and the focus for this podcast is Britain's other frogs. Now we're going to speak about in this podcast introduced frog species, and it's very important to point out that introducing frogs from another country is not good practice. In most circumstances it's illegal, and irrespective of the legal position, it risks introducing disease, it can put native species at risk, and it can also have a detrimental effect on the populations that animals may be moved from. So this podcast is for interest and a bit of frog history, and it is in no way a suggestion that introducing other frog species is a good idea. Now there is one frog species, the common frog, Rana temporaria, that's so ubiquitous and familiar that most people regard it as the one and only frog in the UK. Being ubiquitous, I guess, is a good thing, and this species is found throughout the 4 countries of the United Kingdom, the country of Ireland, and most of our offshore islands as well. And the reason it's familiar is that it's quite happy, if not very happy, in gardens, including urban gardens. So providing there's a pond to breed in, a bit of cover, and it's not too difficult to get under the fence to other gardens, it's quite happy. Does it still warrant its name, the common frog? Well, probably not, because it's not really that common. It doesn't do well in much of the countryside, especially in intensively farmed areas. And it's also a big target at all of its life stages for predation. And it's also been hit by a number of diseases, and some of those have arguably been made worse by climate change recently, and that can impact populations. Nevertheless, I guess it is something to be celebrated that most people, including children, have some knowledge, if not direct experience, of its life cycle, watching frog spawn turn into tadpoles, watching the tadpoles grow legs and emerging as tiny froglets, which is brilliant, really. Now, if you want to know what common frog looks like, rather than me describe it, visit the reptiles and amphibians section of our website at arc-trust.org. And moving on, if Rana temporaria, the not so common frog, is Britain's frog, what do I mean by Britain's other frogs? Well, they come in a number of categories, and the first category I want to consider is introduced species, and front and centre of those is the marsh frog. And the reason I say front and centre is that this European frog species, but it's actually part of a complex of species, and we'll come to that later, has got introduced populations all over the place in Britain. And probably the first of these was a population thought to have been from Hungary that was introduced to Romney Marsh in Kent in the 1930s. Now my granny lived just along the coast in Folkestone, and we used to spend our holidays there, and I'd read about marsh frogs, and sometime in the 1970s I persuaded my rather sceptical dad to drive me out to Romney Marsh to try and find them. Now we happened to go in the Easter holidays, and it was a pretty chilly April day if I remember rightly, and not knowing where to go, he took me to the Royal Military Canal, which runs along the north of the marsh, to a place called Botolph's Bridge. And we wandered along the canal there, and we wandered along some of the dykes that cross the fields adjacent to the canal, and eventually we did find a single, rather sorry and cold-looking marsh frog sat on a muddy bank. So there you go, Dad, they are here. So, spurred on by that success, as soon as I could get to Romney Marsh under my own steam, I went back to Botolph's Bridge several times actually. The first time was in the early summer, and I was amazed. It was completely different. There were loads of marsh frogs there, and some of them were absolutely huge. They looked to be about twice the size of a common frog, and they'd make these amazing leaps from the bank into the water, with really long back legs trailing behind them. Super impressive frogs. And walking along the canal, I was also treated to the never-to-be-forgotten loud chorus of their laughing call. Their name is Pelophylax ridibundus, which literally means laughing frog. And to top it all, with all of this abundance of living frog flesh, that had clearly attracted grass snakes, and we saw 1 or 2 big snakes basking on the canal banks that the frogs were using. So needless to say, I was totally hooked. And ever since then I've taken regular trips back to Romney Marsh, most recently when my son was at the University of Kent. So today, well over a human generation on from my first experience, we together still found good numbers of frogs, and we'd normally see at least one grass snake whenever we visited. We tended to go to our favourite site close to the town of Appledore, again in the north of the marsh. Marsh frogs have spread from Romney Marsh right through that end of Kent and into neighbouring counties, and other colonies have taken off in other parts of the country. Now, I mentioned earlier that marsh frogs are part of a big complex group of frogs, all classified as Pelophylax and sometimes collectively known as green frogs or water frogs. Now, within the Pelophylax genus, there are some complicated geographic genetics that all get a bit mixed up in the UK because frogs do seem to have been introduced from different parts of Europe. Now, we've traditionally regarded them at one end as being the big old marsh frogs, and at the other end being the more dainty pool frogs, and we're going to talk about pool frogs later on in this podcast. And in between sits the edible frog, which is a bit of a genetic cocktail of pool and marsh frogs. Again, if you want to see what these look like, go to our website and you can see some photographs of them there. And the populations in the UK, which range from Somerset to East Yorkshire with many stops in between, they're actually a mix of those species. We could do a whole other podcast on trying to get that sorted out, but let's park that for now. And what we're going to do is move on to a different species in the introduced category, and that's surprisingly the European tree frog. So here's an interview I recorded earlier which will give you the story. One species that's made a delightful addition to Britain's frogs is a European tree frog. And there was a time when a colony of this bright green arboreal species lived in the New Forest. Now today I'm really lucky to be speaking by phone to Martin Noble, who is probably one of the most experienced naturalists in the New Forest. So Martin, tell us a little bit about your circumstances at the time and what you can remember about tree frogs in the New Forest.
Well, my memories go back to 1986 when I first heard about the tree frogs, but I've done a bit of research since, so maybe if I start with the correspondence I had from a number of people, predominantly from Derek Fraser, Dr. Derek Fraser, I think may have been chairman of the British Herpetological Society at the time, and he made some investigation, talked to a few local people, and looking at what he wrote, the information he got was that about 1961 was the first confirmed record of the presence of these little green frogs in a particular pond in the New Forest, and that was more or less continuous right through until about 1986. Derek Fraser went down and visited the site and confirmed that what he saw there were definitely tree frogs. Another chap who many of us know, called Charles Snell, subsequently visited as well, and he confirmed the same thing. Sadly, by the time I arrived in 1986, I couldn't find any there. The last record, the local people, bear in mind it's on the edge of the forest, but there are cottages nearby, and the people living in these cottages actually had heard the frogs, or at least one, on a fairly regular basis up until 1985.
Okay.
So when I got there in 1986, one of the first things I did was spend some evenings up there in the suitable warm weather, the right time of the year and everything, and heard absolutely nothing. So that particular site apparently had failed, and as far as we know, there haven't been any signs or sight of tree frogs at that site ever since. Having said that, in 1988,
yes,
a couple of years later, I found a tree frog in another pond, not far away, maybe a couple of miles away from there, single male calling. So in that area, clearly the frogs were still present, or a frog was still present. But bearing in mind, the females are very difficult to find. They're easy to see if you can see them, but because the females don't call, they don't draw attention to themselves. And if you're looking for a tiny little frog, which is maybe a couple of 2.5 centimetres long if you're lucky, in the middle of a huge, vast area of heathland, if it's not calling, you're not going to find it.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah.
The call is extremely loud, and you can hear it from quite a long way away. So I'm quite confident there weren't any males around at that time, and that was the last time that actually anybody saw anything there. There was another sighting in, I think, 1986 or thereabouts, at a pond in the north of the forest. A very good friend of mine actually saw it. and confirmed it was definitely a European tree frog. Again, a single male. But I've been to that pond several times since and never seen anything. There was a suggestion that because there was a group of people who saw it at the same time, that maybe one of them might have popped back and caught it subsequently and taken it away, because we never saw that frog again. So that was the latest event. I have to say there have been a number of other incidents in other parts of the forest, mainly on the west side of the forest, where tree frogs have been seen. I've seen some myself and heard some as well. Sort of scattered sightings in ponds in different parts of the west side of the forest. And that really, as far as the wild frog is concerned, is about an end to it, I suppose.
Really, yeah. So, were the ponds that they were seen in, were they all quite similar? Were they the typical small heathland ponds that you find in the New Forest? And what was the surrounding vegetation like?
Yes, they're similar visually, and the vegetation in the open heathland of the forest, which where all these sites were that I looked at, are broadly similar, with heather, grass, rough grass, and gorse, and brambles in some places, and a few low shrubs of sallow and things like that. And the frogs sit in amongst the males at least, sit in amongst the low shrubs around the edge of the pond and call in the evening, starting around about dusk, and call for quite a long time. And then we haven't got large numbers here, not since I've been here, but in places where there are large numbers, which I've heard in France, for example, it's absolutely deafening, the call they make.
Yeah.
A single male, if you're close to it, is quite painful to the ears.
Yes,
it really is a piercing call. So not easy to mistake for anything else, I think. But as far as the ponds are concerned, the vegetation, it is mostly acid heathland they're living in and around. There's most of the sites have some shrub, a layer in the form of sallow mostly, and a few willow plants occasionally, holly occasionally, those sort of things growing around the edge of the pond. But the water quality is the thing we really were concentrating on, because we had a feeling at the time that probably it was the water quality which attracted them and provided their ability to breed.
Yes, of course.
Not entirely sure that's correct, but that was the theory at the time. I did some pH testing at the time, and certainly the ponds where they were found, the pH was near to neutral, probably slightly on the alkaline side of neutral in most cases, rather than the more typical forest ponds, which are rather acid. So I think maybe the frogs, to some extent, were selecting a pond which had that right sort of water quality. But it's the survival of the tadpoles, I think, is the factor that possibly is a limiting factor. The predation maybe, water quality isn't good enough, or maybe they won't grow quickly enough. They're quite late spawners, unlike our common frogs, which tend to spawn down here in February. The tree frogs tend to spawn much, much later, usually March, sometimes even April before they spawn.
And they're much smaller clumps of spawn as well, aren't they? They're only sort of
walnut size. They do spawn. Each female can spawn more than once.
Yes, yeah.
But they are smaller. Each individual clumps will be smaller numbers of eggs in them, and they obviously take a lot longer to metamorphose, although they are laid during the warmer part of the year. But that again will depend on the weather.
Yeah.
So, good hot summer, provided the ponds don't dry up, they will be better than a cold, wet summer.
Of course,
not surprisingly.
So an interesting addition to the New Forest natural history for a time at least. And I guess we can always keep our fingers crossed that you never know, they might turn up somewhere else again. Very interesting talking to you, Martin, and thank you for that insight into the delightful European tree frog.
Thank you very much.
There are one or two other species of introduced frog that have bred in the wild in the UK, including, rather worryingly, the North American bullfrog. Frankly, that would not really be a welcome addition to our natural history, as it is a giant and would eat almost any wildlife smaller than its enormous bulk. But now I want to move on to the next category of Britain's other frogs, which is Britain's other native frogs. And to tell the story of the first of these, Here's a recorded interview from a different part of the British Isles. One of Britain's other frogs is the agile frog. Now, this species looks quite similar to a common frog, but it's normally quite light in colour. And as its name suggests, it looks a bit more athletic. It's slightly slimmer, it's got a more streamlined body, and it's got long back legs, which makes it a good jumper. Now, don't start thinking that every skinny frog you find in the garden is an agile frog. These might be widespread in Europe, but in Britain, they're only found on the island of Jersey. And to be honest, they did almost disappear from there. I'm with John Pennell, and John has been involved with agile frogs for decades. So, John, first question: how bad did it get with the agile frog?
Well, Howard, it was really 1993, certainly the early 90s, when it was first realised that the population was in a really catastrophic state. We knew that the population size had been declining throughout the 1980s. By mid-1980s, we were down to two sites where we had populations of agile frog, and then one of them was effectively sterilised by a spill of agricultural pesticide.
Wow.
By 1987, we were down to a single population at Wainay in the southwest corner of the island. At very low numbers, we started counting clumps of frog spawn and realised that the population had declined hugely. So by 1993, the Agile Frog Group was set up, which was a sort of collaboration between Durrell Zoo, the government of Jersey, and a number of local naturalists to try and do some conservation work to see if we could turn around the population.
Okay, and that work was kind of focused on Wainay originally, was it?
Well, again, Wainay being the last site, we did a lot of work down there. But the first thing we did was to set up some captive breeding sites. So we ended up with 6 small compounds, different places around the island, in order to give some safety to the agile frog population in Jersey. Because of course, when we're down to a single site, surrounded by housing, again, any other spill of pesticides, we've had oil spills in the area, a single population like that was very vulnerable. So our first action was to set up these 6 compounds so we could get small captive populations to try and do some captive breeding.
Okay, and did you couple that kind of captive breeding with habitat management?
Absolutely. Wainay, it's one of the best sites in Jersey for its zoological diversity, really. So it's always been heavily managed. It's a 25 hectare site. It's very, very small.
Yeah.
It's an old sand dune. Western gorse grows madly down there. Lots of willow. So we've always done habitat management, and we did an amount of work to try and deepen the ponds as well, because the ponds at Wainay were sort of seasonal dune slacks, and they were drying out a little bit earlier than we wanted to see in the summer. So we deepened them so they'd hold water a little bit longer.
So what's the situation at Wainay today? I mean, what sort of counts are you getting? And tell us a little bit about the sort of reintroduction or the introduction program there to bolster the population.
Yeah, well, the captive breeding compounds, whilst we managed to maintain populations there, it wasn't hugely successful. So we turned to head starting. Working with Durrell, we actually we raised funds and purchased a dedicated head starting unit in an old shipping container. And so what we were doing, we were harvesting spawn as soon as we could get it after it had been laid. Leaving it in captivity till it had hatched and the frogs had grown their back legs, and then we were reintroducing it initially down at Wainay, then back to the Nuamos site where we'd had the agricultural spill. In the last few years, we've been introducing it to a third site as well. So it took many, many years of reintroducing hundreds of tadpoles a year at Wainay before the population really seems to have stabilised at the moment and really picked up. So we're getting between 100 and 150 clumps of spawn laid most years now at Waynay, which tells us certainly what the minimum population size of the females are. So
that's quite impressive, really, isn't it? So 100 to 150 means that you've got a population of potentially 100 to 150 females, and so probably a couple of hundred frogs. Which is, what do you reckon you went down to at the lowest point?
It must have been incredibly low. Some years, the sort of I forget the years exactly, but between 1990 and 1994, there was at least 2 years where we found no frog spawn at all. So we think it could well have come down to possibly single figures, but it's there's a high likelihood it would have come down to very, very low numbers of double figures of frogs left in Jersey. So a real bottleneck for the population.
So there was a serious risk of it going extinct on Jersey.
Absolutely. This is really what galvanized people back in the early 90s to set up the Agile Frog Group in Jersey, because there was a great fear it was critically endangered and well on its way to extinction.
Yeah. And what do you think the future looks like? You've got these 3 sites now. I think you said Noirmont and the third site are not quite as hot, but what do you think the future looks like?
Well, again, Waynay, it's a protected site. Over here in Jersey, we designate, similar to your triple SI system, we designate sites of special interest. So Waynay is protected. It's well managed and looked after. There is a lot of development around it, surrounded by housing estates, for instance, which has a benefit because some of those houses have ponds in the garden, and we do have some breeding in garden ponds. But like I say, we have had spills of heating oil, for instance, which have made their way down to the breeding ponds. When we've done water quality testing, we find pesticides, herbicides, which are from sort of classic garden products turning up in the ponds as well. This is all from garden use. So whilst it's the biggest population, it's still threatened, I suppose. And in the other 2 sites, we're still getting very low numbers. So we haven't really hit double figures in a consistent way in either of those other 2 sites. But we know Waynay took 10, 15, maybe 20 years before the population rebounded. So we'll keep on supplementing the populations at the reintroduction site and the introduction site consistently, and hopefully in another 5 or 10 years we'll be seeing at least double figures of spawn laid in those.
Let's hope so. So the future looks reasonable, in your opinion, do you think?
I'm certainly going to be hopeful about that. I think we've still got a long way to go, and I think key things are to establish a couple more sites where we can introduce populations, and particularly to create some satellite sites so we can have meta populations around the main breeding ponds. But of course, when as I say, we've still got just a few thousand eggs being recruited every year. The spawn clumps that are laid in Jersey are much smaller than the spawn clumps we're seeing in Europe. So they can be as small as 50 eggs, probably maximum of 300 eggs in a spawn clump. So if we get 100 clumps of spawn in 1 year, that's only 3,000 tadpoles, and as we know, the mortality of tadpoles is massively high. So the recruitment every year is going to be relatively low. It's going to be a slow process, and until we get enough to harvest to, as I say, expand the introduction sites, I think we're still in a slightly dodgy position for the immediate future.
Okay, well, look, let's keep our fingers crossed. Let's be positive, because it would be, we would love the Agile frog to be one of Britain's other frog species for many, many years to come. Brilliant. Thank you so much for talking to us, John.
Thanks, Howard. It's been a pleasure.
As we reach the end of this podcast, it's impossible to talk about Britain's other frogs without speaking about the pool frog. Now, you might be surprised, given what I said earlier about marsh frogs and the complex of species that they're part of, that the pool frog is a native species. The pool frog comes in several geographic races, and the northern race pool frog is now considered to be native to Britain. Now, in the 1990s, there were several things that came together to point to that native status. And it was unfortunate timing because right at the same time, the last individual of the last known population died. And because up until then there was still a question mark about whether that population was native, it didn't receive much conservation focus. So just from those few comments, you can probably tell there's a lot to speak about when it comes to the pool frog, including the whole story of bringing it back to Britain. You could say that the pool frog really is Britain's other frog, and the good news is that there is now a population that's doing okay in Norfolk. The pool frog really has a story behind it, and to do that story justice, we're going to cover it in another podcast. So for now, thank you for listening, and look out for other topics in the podcast series from amphibian and reptile conservation.